and welcome to another episode of the Africa Construction Law Podcast. My name is Yolanda Walker and I'm a Director of Africa Construction Law. I'm also a partner at DWA. Today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Ehab Mukhtar. He is CEO of PetroGas Libya. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Soccertech Advisory, for sponsoring this podcast. Let's start with you and your journey and how you even arrived at PetroGas Libya.
Well, I'm British Libyan, so by that nature, I had the privilege or access to, shall we say, the Libya market when I graduated from university. I worked here for a while, a logistics company, building up corporate experience, managerial experience. So I got a good firm structure and understanding in terms of how business from SMEs works. And I got the opportunity to hear about Libya in 2008. It was a country coming out of being under sanctions, and the oil sector was opening up, and there was a lot of opportunities. I studied international business at university, so I thought it was a good area to test what I've learned and put into practice and see how that works out. So PetroGas was owned by my uncle. His name's Mukhtar. He and a number of his partners founded this company once the sanctions were lifted and private companies were allowed back into the countries to operate, and they were an oil services company. I remember at the time on holiday when I got the chance and the call to when he heard about what I was doing, to say, why don't you come out to Libya, see what it's like. If you don't like it, you can kind of go back to the UK and go about in your career.
Had you ever lived in Libya before? Or?
Not lived, but visited regularly. Yeah. My parents still have roots there. We have a strong family bond and culture. We keep in touch with our relatives. We attend occasions when there's something to celebrate in terms of weddings, family events, friends events. So that familiarization, at least to begin with, in terms of going into a new place where you're going to live and set up and change the way you're going about your life is something that maybe couldn't have been as challenging as maybe someone that's gone to somewhere where they don't know anyone in the country and you're kind of just setting up blind.
And when was this? Just what?
2008.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, what's there to lose at the end of the day, like I said.
So what role did you go into when you started in 2008?
Because of my background in logistics, we worked with U.S. conglomerate General Electric. We had already were their sales representative at that moment in time, focusing mainly on power generation. So I handled mainly the movement of field service engineers that performed the maintenance, outages, and installation of new equipment. And I was also given a portfolio to manage one of our other international partners, which was a Chinese company. And basically from there, a bit as a business development role. So like I said, back in that time, sanctions having just been lifted, Libya was looking to improve its infrastructure facilities and so on. And pipelines plays an important role in that. So for me, that was kind of a huge exposure to basically multinationals working in a country that's heavily reliant on the presence of international organizations, because in terms of manufacturing, logistics, and so on, there wasn't that capability or what you'd call capacity to kind of engage in that. Don't forget, at that time, Libya was still under the rulership of the Gaddafi regime.
Yes.
He'd been in control of the country for 40 plus years. Like I said, sanctions are lifted. There's high expectations, but at the same time, it's sort of like, okay, private business is not something that's well established.
Let's just talk a little bit more about PetroGas itself. It essentially covers a wide breadth of tech, and a lot of that's engineering and power generation systems. What would you say PetroGas is known for?
Technology solutions provider. So rather than being, as oil and gas is known, kind of this dinosaur that exists, how does technology play a role in modernizing it or improving and optimizing what's done in that industry? So what's the added value?
So you're involved in upstream, downstream activities, but also providing technical solutions.
Like you said, it's broken up into 3 streams. So you have to ask yourself as a company, where do you want to apply those solutions to terms of what are called well services? So from that aspect, we decided to focus on above ground. I said we focused on power generation. What are the technologies that are, people think power generation, I think just power plants. But in reality is you have to kind of like deep dive into the engineering and technical aspects, and you realize that there's another world in that of just moving equipment, parts. And then, like I said, in recent years comes the digital aspects. Those are all now considered assets in today's business. They have a value, they're worth something. And how do you make production improve and become more efficient? And you do that by hooking them up and calling it the Internet of Things, and basically having an industrial revolution within the actual industry itself. So these aspects are super interesting for us, like as a private business, because it allows us to invest and see where's the market globally heading, and then looking at Libya's infrastructure and understanding, well, my customer has a gas turbine that's been sitting there since the 1970s, and its performance is slowly declining. What available toolkits, expertise, strategic planning that you can take from a company, like I said, back in the day it was GE, but today it's Baker Hughes. That's another story altogether in terms of how the industry is changing in terms of names and ownership. But that's why we look at it from a technology solutions aspect rather than the brand name. But how do we take that concept and then apply it locally?
It's a constantly moving picture, an evolution of technology and an evolution of solutions. But then equally, the solutions that you are applying are bespoke to the context, so bespoke to the particular project. And what you might provide as a solution for that gas turbine that you mentioned in one area might not be what you provide elsewhere in terms of a solution. It sounds like you constantly need to be on your toes as a business.
Yeah, definitely. As an entrepreneur, I care a lot about Libya, so that, and our customers, that we try to bring the right solution to that particular problem or challenge that exists.
Well, let's go back to 2008 then. You've arrived in this business, you're getting to understand it, and I imagine you spend the first year or two working your way through and really mastering your day-to-day. Fast forward a couple of years or 3 years, and then you have this massive political shift. At that point, post the fall of Gaddafi, what did that mean for the business and the economic landscape that you're working within? And obviously, you've got an unstable political scenario too. How did that impact where you drove your technologies, or even just your day-to-day at that point?
It was in 2011 when things changed in terms of the trajectory of Libya. Like I said, coming out of sanctions and the economic downfall. It's not normal, to have that kind of disruption for a business, as you can understand, where your concept is built on understanding where finances are going to be and planning ahead and knowing when projects are going to come online and where you're going to target and move your resources, people, and so on. So when that change came, it was kind of, what do you do in that situation where a country seems, at least from the outside, in chaos? And then how do you mobilize your people? How do you keep managing projects? How do you keep things going ahead? And basically, it was a kind of a moment where you have to look at the challenge that you have in front of you, just the basic concept of sort of, how do I make sure that I can get out of my home and travel to work without like the what's going on around you, like impacting. But then, like I said, because of the geography of Libya, one area can be completely fine, and then on another area where there could be issues or different challenges happening. So in terms of as a business, we learned to be flexible in terms of maneuvering, mobilizing different people. So if one particular area is facing challenges in terms of mobilizing people, which are engineers, because they're the most important aspect in terms of production, it's sort of like looking, okay, if we can't go from Tripoli, can we mobilize our people from Benghazi to get to the sites of where we need to be? So you have to sit down within an organization and kind of like, how do you work the logistics around that? And you think to yourself, well, thank goodness that I had kind of like the experience and grounding here in terms of working in logistics and understanding the concepts of supply chain management and so on. That foundation helps you to kind of like look at how do you change different aspects of your business? What strategy do you need to do? How you communicate with people and kind of reassure them in terms of that deliverables are still going to be met. Something people that probably don't take into consideration in developed economies is sort of even just the basic concept of making sure that these people are getting their salaries paid and being able to know that there's some kind of job security as well when you're in such a volatile market. So we learned and built that capacity up since 2011 because of the change. Like I said, that also means that any planning aspects of the business that we had in mind had to be reevaluated. We had huge investments where we were looking to establish localized workshops, so more work was done in country, having training facilities, having local engineers being trained by international. That kind of had to be put on hold and reorganized in a way sort of companies weren't ready to come into Libya because of that huge shift. So how do you go about to, instead of halting that investment, maybe taking a more proactive role in terms of us hiring the people and using our experience and our access to international companies to kind of build up a reference point by which where our company itself can take on the challenges that were normally handed out to the big conglomerates that were working in the country. We still provided the service instead of providing, in our case, technology solutions, the spare parts, and so on. But we had to go ourselves to the clients and listen more to the technical aspects of what the problems were, and our people then remotely communicating and then sitting down and figuring out, as you know, in terms of management, how do you then apply that?
Supply chain management is so crucial, and just taking a step back and having that extra thought or extra time inputted into your planning process, it was key to success. You must have had to have navigated all sorts of obstacles within that planning process and also accounted for things going wrong. How did that work?
Well, we're a private business, so we're self-sufficient our own finances. So, for example, we don't have any bank loans, any commitments. So, management of capital is really important. When you have these kinds of situations, you don't want your capital to be tied up in specific projects. So, sort of, where do you put your capital so that we're not talking just about profit? Because, like I said, our mindset and our organization that we're trying to create is one of building up the capacity of the people that we have. So if you're going to do that, what should I focus on in this particular moment of time, like in terms of short-term, medium-term, long-term business concepts? Not only that, but you had people that used to be the founders of the company, in our particular case, that then decided to move into politics. That you can't miss too much politics and business.
No.
So when you're asking about moving from business development and senior management, that's when I got the big jump to being a GM of the company.
Wow.
And then...
So what year was this?
So this was between 2012 and 13. So approximately a year after the shift.
Yeah.
So it was a big jump from managing 2 or 3 portfolios to then managing a company.
I imagine then a slightly different world come 2011, 2012. Yeah. And just picking up on what happened then, the oil output from Libya completely decreases for a period. And then politically, you have these objectives to increase that output. Did that change the nature of the technology that you were doing? I'm keen to acknowledge we're still back in 2012, 2013 here.
Sure, we'll fast forward quickly.
Yeah, to where we are now with
today.
tech. But did that change where what you had as objectives, especially if your founders are then moving into the political realm?
So just to kind of give you a sense of today and before, there was a lot of aspirations for Libya after Gaddafi regime had fallen and a new authority had come to power, that Libya had opened up basically. It was seen to be a country that was going to be more aligned with Western values and wanting democracy in terms of a more open, free market. And as a result of that, obviously, because of the huge reserves that the country has, there was this expectation that Libya was open for business again. So you had a lot of companies coming in, or businesses, should we say, coming in, governments as well, and assessing and looking and seeing, oh, there's great potential here, without really looking into kind of what do the people need, and how have they coped over these last few years and so on. So that kind of brings it into the aspect of, like you said, in terms of looking at on a grounded level, sort of what do people need? What kind of capacity do I have to offer so that you have the right kind of workforce available to kind of meet the potential of what the Libya market has to offer. So production actually never really dropped that much from 2011 up until 2014, 15. We actually managed to, or the NOC at that time managed to reach 1.6 million barrels. So as you know, Libya is one of the biggest producers in Africa.
Yes.
And so Libya is quite substantial in that sense in terms of measuring where the country is and what it can offer in terms of to Europe and the global oil market. But before that, Libya was looking to increase production up to 2 million barrels. So that was the target at that time. But then because of the political instability and so on, like I said, that was faced in 2015, we had another challenge as a private business to deal with, where the country headed into more disruptions and volatility. And if you look into the news, it was probably even described as being a civil war.
Yeah.
So, and that's because of the political differences between what's categorized as East and West Libya. So,
and at that point, are you armed, ready with the resilience and the flexibility lessons that you learned from 2011 to or you're ready to deploy those tactics in the sense of not necessarily survival at this point as a company, but as a further evolution into, the next phase of whatever's going to be the outcome following this civil war?
The reality is, you think that we're planning for this, but you can't foresee these things, because as a business, your mindset is to be optimistic, and especially in that part of the world, to kind of say, how are we going to generate value, profit for the business and also for our partners? So when you look at that, you have to readjust. So it's almost like you have to kind of have in your drawer or in your tools like a crisis management team to kind of, like you said, deploy whenever like there's political instability. Sort of, what do we do in this situation? Who do we call? What kind of meetings do we need to have? Where's our, like I said, our capital right now? Do we need to kind of like reassess how that's being used and change it? So,
did you encounter any immediate threats or anything that warranted a quick response in that period?
Obviously, when there's political instability, there's you have to take kind of like measures in terms of the first and foremost, as you know, and especially in the oil and gas industry, sort of like safety's a huge kind of like important metric that's measured. There's even companies that proudly announce when they have 0% in terms of incidents and accidents and so on. But in Libya, that's a completely different kind of bar by how you have to measure. So even building an understanding of how do you create an evacuation plan, for example, if your person's in the field to be moved out when something goes wrong. So we have to look at those kind of strategies, be in coordination with, for example, foreign embassies and missions, so that they know where their nationals are, and if something happens, how do you go about to making sure that they can get to a safe evacuation point.
That's that brings it all to a serious point, doesn't it? Really, when you're considering safety and people's lives first and foremost.
Yeah.
Just talking about where you are now and the journey that you would have done from 2015 to date, really, the oil output seems to have increased, but we're looking at a very different world to the world that you would have been in 2008 when you first joined PetroGas, and one which is now looking at moving towards greener technologies, greener fuels and greener solutions. You seem to have moved as a business with the times and developed your technologies with the times to even start addressing things like gas flaring and addressing or providing solutions for carbon capture. Could we talk more about that journey and now what you're doing on a daily basis to help reduce or eliminate gas flaring? I think that's one of Libya's national oil corporation's goals.
Yeah. Like you said, it's now considered the energy sector in terms of reimagining what the demands of today are globally, and oil and gas is just seen as a basket for that. So people are looking at Libya in terms of how do you look at its energy portfolio and what it has to offer. So 2008, 2011, 15, 16, 17, there was still a huge demand for oil and gas. But then you saw a transformation, or a transition as they like to call it, into other forms of energy that can be mobilized or accessed, particularly in the African continent and North Africa, because of the exposure in terms of an availability of resources from the sun, and also other forms of minerals as well that are available. And during the political landscape changes, it brought in a leadership that looked at the global market and saw that there was Paris summits and climate agreements being signed and pledges being made. And it was for them a chance to see that Libya should step into that arena and be more relevant in the global standing of what these different countries are doing. There's also a movement of where the money markets are. So in terms of getting the investments and the interests of international companies and remaining relevant. So as you said, Libya in 2021, I think it was, in 22, joined in pledges that were made at COP to, by 2030, considerably reduce gas flaring, whereas I think they were aiming for net zero. It's a very difficult target, but or an optimistic one, but they made that pledge, and as a result, it obviously created interests. Libya is still considered a country, despite its challenges and political volatility, an economy with low-hanging fruit. So the immediate accessibility in terms of geopolitics, or shall we say, where it's located, its access to specific markets, creates a demand and an interest to push or encourage the movement towards green energy. So solar being one, it also led to not only the NOC announcing that it was going to commit to zero flaring, but also a renewables authority was created, which looked at how to harness and encourage having solar energy as another form or availability on the grid. And we looked at what are we doing as part of that? And from our portfolio, do we have availability to get our people to talk with oil and gas producers, companies, and the NOC about what's it thinking? How do you have a strategy for that? How do you go about that? Is there a specific type of solution or package that you're looking for? The interesting aspect is that even though the oil and gas sector is controlled or monitored by the NOC, there's a whole bunch of different oil and gas companies that have different objectives, different aims. So as a result of that, you have this opportunity to go in with different technologies and ideas and look at, could I do a pilot project with this company? How do I go about mitigating the challenges of how much flaring it's doing? And I look at its geographic location. What does that mean in terms of how do I create value for them? If we can change like what's being flared as gas, and then can we reuse it in the facility to create power generation? Or can you bottle it up and put it in a truck or a pipeline and send it to the terminal? And the interesting aspect of this industry is that you talk to talented, smart engineers or even entrepreneurs that are constantly bouncing ideas in terms of how this goes on. So yeah, it created a very fast transition, I'd say, in terms of Libya just looking to maximize the output of its oil and gas production. Also, kind of, how does it look at itself as an energy source for the continental side, from the regional side, and also globally.
But just looking at the impact on the economy for a country that's heavily reliant upon, or had been previously, oil output for its economic stability, to come out of that and pledge, into new technologies, new greener solutions. It's future-proofing for the people of Libya in the sense that you're investing in those tech. I just want to pick up on the carbon capture and the reuse of. I read that or looking into tech that reuses that energy, I think you just mentioned, and creating electricity and other fuels from it. So there is an element of becoming carbon neutral as a first step. And then, what's next is that it seems quite an exciting time to be looking into all of these projects and having the opportunity to as well.
Yeah. Like you said, in terms of how you asked, in terms of how the technology is applied in that regard, and then as the business, and then you kind of have to realize, as one of our executives keeps telling us, is that you've got no choice in the matter. This is the way that the world is the area that the world is moving to, and if you don't, you're going to get penalized in some way or form or another. So it's better to start discussing and talking and even trying to invest in this rather than paying a higher price later down the line for trying to mobilize these different solutions that are available at this time. And it's also, as you know, but like, it's better to have this discussion now and while the industry is evolving, rather than getting left behind and then trying to see where does Libya and private business fit into the space of where the global energy market is. One of the things actually that Libya's done to kind of move into that space is something called the Libya bid round at the NOC. So it's looked at concessions and opening them up again to encourage international investment, both as IOCs and then also for smaller, medium-sized investors coming back into Libya.
What's the output of that been like? Has it been received well?
Yeah, it's been very well received. We've had big oil majors sitting down and having negotiations with the NOC about developing different fields, particularly the availability of gas, because it's seen as a there's a lot of ideas being floated around. We have a big pipeline. It's called Greenstream that feeds natural gas currently from Libya to Italy. There's people that are developing theories in terms of how do you maybe then use that infrastructure rather than lose it to basically transfer or carry cleaner energy to Europe.
The future for PetroGas Libya, where do you think it will be in 5 to 10 years' time in terms of energy and energy transition?
So the beauty about our business, we've created a broad spectrum of where we can apply ourselves. Because we're always teaming up with international partners, it's kind of given the job and the company this availability to broaden itself and move into any particular market. So when you say 5 to 10 years down the line, one of the primary aspects for me is how do I get more of that value that we have accessible from our international partners to developing the people we have inside the organization, having the correct structure that meets what we need in the local market, but also in terms of meeting the international requirements of code of ethics, compliance, transparency, that, like I said, because of what Libya's gone through, to have that trust in private business that perhaps before wasn't a given since, like I said, the sanctions were lifted. So that's my aim, and obviously to grow PetroGas. Also taking on the challenge of doing some of the work that before was maybe left to, like I said, international companies, and being, should we say, a representative or a brand for our country and the continent as well, in terms of you can do it even in the most difficult of environments.
I think it's exciting times ahead as you evolve, you adapt, and you grow.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you again for having me and for